Blah, 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 blah. I'm a very accomplished speaker. I thought it should dispel that thought. I just blur my terms. If I have one weakness, and I have many, it's I talk fast if I get going. So slow me down if I talk too fast. I am not, for those that are aficionados of shipwrecks on Cape Cod, I'm not Bill Quinn. Bill Quinn was the essential guy that knew. You may remember him. He was a photographer, passed away about 5 years ago now. Wrote several books on shipwrecks. Some of my knowledge came from him on shipwrecks, but you're not getting Bill tonight. He's not with us anymore. He died at age 87, so he had a good full life. You got me. Now, as pointed out, I'm at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum as one of the volunteers there, now serving as their president. But we're part of a larger organization called the Cape Cod Museum Trail. Some of you may know it. Thus, we work very closely with the Historical Society here on a number of different issues, computer systems, a bunch of things we're working together on. So it's a natural for us to share resources as best we can. Thus, I'm here. All our workers there, the difference between our two organizations, all our workers at the museum, our museum, are volunteers. Fortunately, we have a pretty good base of Coast Guard people. Cape Cod is thick with Coast Guard people, as you probably know. It is the museum. We try to suggest that the Cape Cod story can be told from the Coast Guard perspective, and vice versa. The Coast Guard story can be told from the Cape Cod perspective. You may not know, and I'm not going to dwell too much on Coast Guard here. I'll get to the shipwrecks here in a second. But the Coast Guard birthplace is here in Massachusetts. The Coast Guard began with 3 organizations, one of which we're going to be hitting a little bit tonight. There were several other organizations, but the Revenue Cutter Service, which was, as the name implied, dates back to the first year of Washington's administration, 1790. The Lighthouse Service that dates back to Boston Light, obviously Massachusetts too, and which was erected in 1710, and then the Life-Saving Service, which became the Life-Saving Service from what was called the Massachusetts Humane Society. And again, that's a birth in Massachusetts beginning, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too. So it's appropriate for us to be here. We're one of only 2 museums in the country that are Coast Guard dedicated freestanding museums. Hopefully very soon, 5-6 years, we're going to have a national museum. The proposed location right now is New London, Connecticut. I'm not a real fan of that. I'd rather have it in Boston because that's kind of ties to the, first of all, if you build it, they will come, is not a term that works very well from my experience. As mentioned, I was the director of the New England Aquarium. We looked all over the country, and there's an example of that, and I'm really digressing quite a bit. There's the Florida Museum in Tampa, fantastic museum. It was just out of downtown, just far down of town, that it failed within a year. No one showed up. So having said on that bright note, we are going to be talking about shipwrecks. I am going to, though, at the end, if there's time, lead over to one other subject that it's my time to talk about that subject. I think you'll find interest. Some of you have heard this from me before. I won't dwell on it, but save that as a surprise at the end, maybe. It's appropriate to talk about it today or this year. The shipwrecks, there are, as far as we know, 3,000 or more shipwrecks. And can we do the front one down lower? That would be better if I can. I don't really need to read my notes. Maybe I do. Sure. Yes, yeah. No? I think it is. I think I'll read a little better. Mm-hmm. There are, as far as we know, there have been about 3,000 or more shipwrecks on Cape Cod and around here since Europeans started to come here. We don't know many of them. In fact, I'll go through the first one that we're at least aware of, and certainly there was many before this time. The National Park Service suggests there's more like 5,000 shipwrecks. The reason we don't know is the shipwrecks were occurring and no one was here to observe them. They occur and it would be washed away in storms. Next winter, they might see some debris on the beach, but that didn't help out identifying what the shipwreck was. So there had been many shipwrecks. Not so much recently, although there have, and we'll dwell on a few of them, some significant ones in the last several decades. But a lot of them were in 1800s and 1700s. So I brought a shipwreck with me, and I'm being quite facetious here. It kind of a segue to missing its bowsprit. when we opened our museum over in Barnstable Village, this is a pretty good size building that we had. It's the old customs house, built in 1856. I could go on and on about the customs house. Doesn't even have to be a museum there. It was the architect was phenomenal, Ami Young. He was the one, just one aside, he was the one that designed the customs house in Boston, if you've been there where the Marriott is. When we opened this, I wasn't there at the time, but some of the initial founders said, how are we going to fill this place up? We had contacts with a lot of museums, we were borrowing information. There's some great stuff coming in, some great model builders, had a substantial museum, but still it was a big space. And one other of the founders said profoundly, open the doors and it will come. And it did. Not just stuff from people's man cave in their basement with their plaque that they got when they crossed the Arctic Circle or something. This was stuff people had that were for 200 years old. And this keeps coming in. 15 years of stuff keeps coming in. One of our challenges is to sort it out and make sure we have the appropriate stuff on display. Some of the stuff surprises us. For example, about 15 years ago, we got the office supply stuff from all the stuff that was the office over in Chatham at the same time the Pendleton disaster, the finest hours, was occurring. And among those was a typewriter. I thought, well, we'll take that. We'll take everything and put it down in archive. We had the typewriter out on display finally right after the film came out. And the kids would come in and they were completely fascinated by it. They were saying, how do you plug it into the computer? How do you backspace? How do you get printouts from it? And you had to display. It was one of those. So sometimes you have stuff that comes in that surprises you, that you put on display. We still don't have this typewriter. We've taken the typewriter back down, but for a short display, it was fine. We often get things like this. This just came in. I brought this because I just got a mail yesterday. I knew it was coming. I knew it was in pretty bad shape. It is. We're going to have to decide whether we're going to restore it or not. And it's not to scale. For those that know the Cutter Eagle, it's a lot more svelte than this, I should say. This is a pretty stubby model, so we have to make a determination. And that's always a hard one. This one obviously has had a tough life. It never was really finished. And we have a couple of model makers going to look at it and decide whether they're going to redo it. So this is our shipwreck. I'm not going to be talking about this. Fortunately, the Eagle has not had a shipwreck yet. Hopefully it never will. So let me look at my notes, make sure we keep somewhat on track. I talked about the Massachusetts Humane Society, and the reason this is important to at least dwell on a little bit is that it is the name is, I think for most people think of Humane Society as taking care of pets and cats and dogs and so forth. That was absolutely not the case with the Massachusetts Humane Society, or Humane Society of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was another name for it. That organization began because just a couple years after the end of the Revolution. In fact, it was 1785. The Revolution ended in 1783. Commonwealth of Massachusetts was formed in 1780. So all that time frame. They formed with a lot. Bowdoin, Governor Bowdoin was the president of it. Many doctors were involved in it. They were responsible for creating Mass General Hospital. Were part of the founding organization and pushed that. But they were concerned about the mariners. There were so many mariners being lost to shipwrecks offshore that they were concerned about that loss of life. How can we help that? And their efforts ranged everything from teaching kids in the public schools in Boston how to swim, thinking that might help some, putting out brochures about how to resuscitate people that are after drowning. But one of their efforts that led to a function of the Coast Guard was the putting huts out on islands offshore. What would happen is there'd be a shipwreck, and some of my mates survive and get on an island, maybe Boston Harbor Islands or some further offshore, and they'll die out there from exposure or starvation or dehydration. They thought that if they put huts out there, which they did, and put a number of them out along the shoreline, people could get in there and survive for a few days until someone determined that there was someone in need of some assistance. So that was one thing that did. That led to life-saving stations run by volunteers, Mass Humane Society life-saving stations. There were 40 some of them ultimately in the end. The end came when the federal government finally decided to form the U.S. Life-Saving Service. Essentially, they merged together. The U.S. Life-Saving Service was paid essentially professionals and so forth. Before that, the Humane Society was all volunteers, minimally funded, but still were able to do some very heroic rescues. So that leads to this. I'm going to talk a little bit about why so many disasters. Why so many people killed at sea? It's an inherently dangerous environment to begin with. We're not naturally suited as humans. We're not fish. We came from there, possibly, if you believe in evolution. But we don't do well in the water. It's out there without a whole lot of assistance. The ambulance is just in around the corner to come and help out. At least certainly it wasn't in the 17th and 18th century and before, 19th century. So that's part of it. You have a harsh environment. You're floating, hoping your ship or whatever you're in is going to continue to float, and you're able to get to land, which is our more natural environment. But why Massachusetts? Massachusetts, Cape Cod is called the graveyard of the Atlantic, of North Atlantic. I should point out, so is Sable Island called the graveyard of North Atlantic, and Outer Banks of North Carolina are called the graveyard. But that's technicality. Each one. It's not necessarily something you want to be proud of, I guess. But why is it here? I'm going to go back to one of my times as a professor with oceanography and meteorology. If you look at this environment here, Cape Cod, what you see in light blue there, as most of you know, I think it's the continental shelf, and very productive fishery for many reasons, which I won't get into. There's the Georges Bank out here. You kind of see a light right in this area in here, Georges Bank. Certain areas of Georges Bank are just a few meters deep. You can run aground there at low tide. So it's a dangerous area, but it's great for fishing. So there's a lot of traffic out there. And then you have this little city down here. I can't remember what it's called, but this city was able to feed up to Boston. I should point out my wife is an avid Red Sox fan. She hates to even mention name New York. It doesn't go well in the house. So you had a lot of traffic that was, as a new nation was forming, a lot of traffic coming up from this area down here, Baltimore, Philly, moving up into Boston, up into Portland, up into Salem. So that was one issue. You had a lot of marine traffic going by, and the odds are some are going to get, whether they catch fire or run into each other, there's something there. But there certainly is more. That more included the environment here. Fog. You have, from oceanography perspective, the Gulf Stream pretty much follows the continental shelf up here. It's called the North Atlantic Current by the time it gets up to here, once it departs Cape Hatteras. And you have remnants of the Labrador Current coming down here, cold water. The two of them together produce fog. That doesn't help with navigation too much. And then you have storms. The storms, and I won't get into technicalities too much with Coriolis and cyclonic action, but most of the storms will come up, many storms will come up here, and the low pressure is going to be going counterclockwise and bring the classic nor'easter storm. Not uncommon, as we all live here know, it's not uncommon with nor'easter. That just pushes the boats back into shore. Well, in that context then, you have these fragile things floating on the water. You have storms coming through. You have low visibility. Then you go take a step back 100 years. You have ships that have virtually no navigation without visibility. They're certainly well before GPS, celestial navigation. Harrison, although he had developed the chronometer and you could do a little bit better, if you couldn't see the stars or the sun, it didn't help you at all. And some of the ways of finding where you were is kind of working your way in towards shore, and ultimately you might bump into shore, which was not a good thing. So you have harsh weather, you have no navigation, and you have wind beyond the roughness of the wind that's typically naturally pushing you in toward the hazard, the shoreline. So you're up here sailing around and you're trying to make this turn to come up into Boston, and as you take this turn, for those that have sailed, some of these old square riggers couldn't go into the wind very much, so they get broadside to the wind and it pushed them right into shore. Then assistance. Again, 18th, 19th century, how do you get assistance? You don't get a radio and say, I need help, or get your cell phone. There weren't ways to notify rescuers. And frankly, there weren't many rescuers to notify anyway. So what happened is the vessels would be pushed into shore, they would get destroyed on the shore, and then they would die of starvation or die of hypothermia, often in the wintertime. So that led to a lot of the search and rescue. Finally, I mentioned the Mass Humane Society, which led to other things and building stations along the shore. But another factor with shipwrecks is the technology. Today we have power boats. we have not sailboats, so you can drive your way out of some dangerous situations. When you're in a sailboat, particularly if you have a sailboat where you've lost a mast, you've lost steerage, you don't have much. There isn't much you could do. Then you say, well, it's just sand. You're just coming into Cape Cod, you're up in the sand, everything's fine, everything is hunky-dory. If you're the coast of Maine, maybe different, there's rocks up there and it tears you apart. Give an example of a case just recently. This was probably 2008, 2007, maybe it was 6, somewhere in that area. There was a fishing boat out of Chatham, a small one, 25 feet or so. It was coming back in from fishing, and they lost track of where they were. It was foggy, and I think they frankly were pretty tired too. They may have fallen asleep or something. And they came ashore. They were both saved. The boat, this is in just by Highland Lake, the sandy beach out there. Fiberglass boat, well built, a working boat. It was destroyed completely within 12 hours, just in that surf. So people understand how challenging that surf is. When you're in a big square rig boat and it gets sideways to the surf, even a 5 to 10 foot waves coming in, it can break you apart very, very fast. They're powerful. So shipwrecks were also common because they couldn't power their way out of the situation. They were stuck. Once they were aground, there wasn't a whole lot they could do. They couldn't call a tugboat to pull them off and so forth. So enough of that, I guess. Let me go to Boston just for a second. We'll come back to the Cape. These are just showing some of these. The first life-saving station with the Mass Humane Society life-saving was down in the Hingham area. I mentioned Boston Light was the first lighthouse that was built. But if you look at Boston Harbor, the channel coming into Boston Harbor, excuse my finger here, was through here. You had to go up through here and down here. The channel that now exists down here by the graves didn't exist back then. It had to be dredged to exist. That's the way most big ships will come into Boston right now, is to come right down through here. Seems a logical way to do it, but it was just treacherous then. So you had to kind of wind your way through it. That's why Boston Light was here, to define where traffic went in. This became true throughout Massachusetts. You had all these treacherous areas, and more lighthouses went up to try to define the best route in. By the way, I'll digress again. The graves. How do you think that was named for? It's not what you think.
No.
It was a Commodore Graves was his name. Unfortunately, it was named after him. But I always thought when I first got here, Graves was like everything else, a graveyard of where all ships went aground, but it wasn't. Again, aside, doesn't have anything to do with, well, I guess it has something to do with shipwrecks indirectly. So let me go on. Let me try to go on. Hold on. The wrong button. The sparrowhawk, as far as we know, although this is unlikely that this is true, but as far as we know, it was the first shipwreck off of Massachusetts, Cape Cod, in 1626. There was, I can guarantee there were shipwrecks before that, but we just don't have any records of them. The sparrowhawk was coming over from England to Jamestown, as it turned out. They got a little off course, and the captain had scurvy. There were all sorts of problems, bad weather coming across. It took 6 weeks to come across the Atlantic, and they encountered fog, all the stuff they rough weather, fog coming in, and they came into Orleans unintentionally, literally came into Orleans, grounded there, and they were able to get off the ship. All of the passengers were able to get off safely. No one was lost. They were able to send some Native Americans were there and got a couple of their people from the ship to go up to see Bradford at the Plymouth plantation, and he sent down supplies and so forth. They're able to rebuild the vessel, get it back underway again. It got a few hundred yards down the beach. This is Orleans. It went aground again, Nauset, and they had to give up on it. They're heading down to try and get back to Jamestown. So the crew or the passengers from the vessel went up to Plymouth, then spent 9 months there until the next ship came that could take them down to Jamestown, which they did the next year. This was in the late summer. It was just getting too late to try to get to Jamestown. And the The trains just weren't working that time of year. This is believe it or not, by the way, I'm going to take this off, it's getting warm. Believe it or not, in 1863, this is 300 years, is that right? No, 200 years after. 200 years after this event, 1863, the shell reappeared. Big storm came in, washed it up, and it came up, and they recovered it. This is it.
Wow.
It was on display at Boston Common. They did some retrofitting of it, restoration of it. It was on display down here, actually, at the Hyannis Maritime Museum for a while. It's now sort of permanently, I'm not sure it's even displayed in an archive up in Plymouth again, at Freedom Hall. But it is something that survived now for approaching 400 years. The sparrow, interesting. There's some more history. I won't go into it, but I put it on because it was the first. I guess it's always. This is an actual photograph of. No, it's not. It's the Witta. This is from the Witta Museum. I think most of you are familiar with the Witta, but it was a historic and lots of life. Although there were pirates off of Cape Cod. This was Black Sam Bellamy. How many here have been to the museum? So you know I'm preaching to the choir. Some of it is lore. I'm not sure how much this is history. It dealt with a little of everything. Pirating. Black Sam came in to visit his relatives in Nantucket and came up and had some other relatives up in the Chatham area, I guess, and Brewster, and had for lack of a better term, liaison with a young beauty there, 16, somewhere between 16 years and 60, depending on whose story you hear. But I think she was much younger. A typical sailor, he took off, left with the ship, and she thought he would be back. She became pregnant. She gave birth to a son, didn't have any support at all. Certainly it wasn't condoned at that point to have this sort of liaison. She left her child in a barn to go get some food and so forth, came back and the child was dead. There's some discussion about how the child died. It could have choked on hay, could have been SIDS, I mean, they didn't know what happened. But she was accused of murder and thrown in jail. And as Joni and I know, she was thrown in jail at the oldest wooden jail in the United States, that's still existing, over right next to our museum in Barnstable. She was there for a few days or a few weeks. It's unclear exactly how long she was there. At that time, it was guilty until proved innocent. She went before a judge finally and found her innocent. She went back waiting for Sam to come back, Black Sam. He finally did. I don't think necessarily for her, unfortunately. Maybe I'm being a little tough with him, but came back and in the process of going by the Cape and caught in a big storm, and he had two ships, both of them sank. There were several hundred of the pirates that were lost. Only 9 survived, 7 off one ship, 2 off the ship that was the Witta that Black Sam was on, and 9 went to trial. 6 were executed for being pirates. Other 3 were let go because they were determined to be slaves on board, that they had nothing to do with piracy. So that's the Witta. Interesting little lore, but it's early 1700 sort of event on Cape Cod. Again, showing how treacherous it was there. Even he was a very talented mariner. And the ship was Witta is a very reputable ship. Of course, he stole it from the British and built it up even more. Next. Oh, that's Black Sam. He's a pretty guy. You can see where Goody Hallett was her name, or Mary or Marie, we're not quite sure what her name was. Hallett was attracted to him, maybe. I don't see that, but this is interesting. Summers, if those that are really into literature and poetry may know Longfellow's poem, and certainly I think we all know the Longfellow, One by Land, Tooth by Sea, and so forth. But in that poem, talks about the Somerset, because the Somerset was sitting in Boston Harbor when Paul Revere rowed across to go over to Charlestown quietly, and got a lot of flack for how did you not see this guy rowing across the harbor. They were also involved in the Battle of north of Noodle Island. I can't remember the name of it. The Battle of Chelsea Creek. It was the first naval event in the Revolutionary War, and they were They had to go rescue the British vessel, smaller British vessel. They sent some smaller, but they couldn't fit into Chelsea Creek, the Somerset. But they were involved. They were also the flagship for the Battle of Bunker Hill. So they got involved in a lot of that early part of the Revolutionary War. This was a warship, a ship of the line. This would be like a high-end nuclear vessel that we would think of today. Highly respected. You know, the Americans one-on-one couldn't stand up to this sort of thing. And they were hated by Cape Codders because they were involved in a blockade. The fishing industry went downhill. A lot of the other industries down, they couldn't get stuff out. So they hated these British. Now, after they spent the time in Boston, went back to England for about a year, came back over and were patrolling off of Provincetown. And actually they're chasing some French squadron that was there in the area. And a big storm came up. And the old scenario again. Big storm came up, took out the Somerset, drove it aground in Peaks Hill Bar, which is just around the corner on the outside from Provincetown, and it broke apart. And 420 people on board. I think they lost only 21. The rest of them got ashore, but they were pretty beat up when they got ashore. So Cape Codders came in, arrested all of them, marched them down. This was a big event. I mean, this was exciting. This was the war. This was a man of war. This was. You know, you can't beat this guy, but our Cape Cod got that shit. They paraded their men down the Cape, and the militia all along the way kept following them down. They weren't brutalizing them at all. I think they actually spent some time in the jail over where I was just mentioning there. They finally took all the men up to Boston and put them on trial. They became prisoners of war. They executed them. The captain, Orry, was taken over to Providence and was exchanged for some American prisoner officers. But it was an event. You can imagine the euphoria on Cape Cod. Us poor little Cape Cod, we've got this warship. This was the one. This was Somerset. They ended up here. But it was just another story in the long history of shipwrecks on Cape Cod. I'm not sure if I was going to say anything more about Somerset. There's probably a lot more to say. But I'll try not to get too far off course. The Somerset, again, went down in 1778. And in 1950, first of all, I think it was in the 1800s, a storm came through and exposed some of the, still there under the sand. Right near shore. I mean, it was at low tide. You could walk out to, but no one could see it because it was covered with sand, 10 or 15 feet of sand. But a big storm came through, a winter storm came through, exposed parts of it, and did the same thing again in 1970. I think it was 73. If you look on, which I did today just to confirm some of my facts, I went on the internet, and you can believe everything, by the way, you see because it said it was exposed again in 2010. It definitely was not. Absolutely, positively was not exposed then, because a very good friend of mine, close friend, is George Price, who was the superintendent of the Seashore, just retired a couple of years ago. He was there. He says, it wasn't exposed. But there is an interesting story. There were a couple other vessels that were exposed. Excuse the expression. Their rib cages were thrown. Before I get off this is the Somerset. In that brief period in the 1970s where it was shown. Shortly after this, days after it, the tide came back in, filled it back in again, and it's been buried since then. Still there. They recovered some of the parts from it. The National Park Service has a few parts. The Maritime Museum up in Providence, the museum up in Providence has one of the ship's knees. Does anyone know what a ship's knee is here? Ship's knee was something you'd use as a structural member down in the frame of the ship. It was a particularly vulnerable, it needed a lot of strength. So it'd take a part of a tree, either a branch that was naturally curved and had, or something that had a knot in it, or something that was really strong. In fact, some of these things were arguably strong as steel, whether it was or not, but very strong wood. They would have that part of it. So the ship's knee, some of them had survived. Ships will have more than one ship's knee just to reinforce it. Apparently, there is one on display from the Somerset up in Providence. The last time I saw a ship's knee being harvested or being brought up was about 20 years ago when a truck came up from South Carolina that brought several things we use for ship's knees for the redo of the Constitution, when they redid that, and they had ship's knees, but they're not used today. Steel is used, obviously, and it wasn't. This became out of fashion by the late 1800s or before. Ship's knees weren't used much anymore. But again, I digress. Nice looking out there. Go out there, it could be out gin and tonic, floating around the water, not a big problem. This is looking down from Highland Light. This is part of that area. Just north of here is Peaks Hill. Of the 3,000 to 5,000 shipwrecks, many of them at Peaks Hill. Just it's a place you turn up there. And there were several big disasters that occurred here. I won't go into all. I have a hard time going through all 5,000 of these right now tonight. I'll hold off some for it. I want to go back for a second while I'm thinking of it to the Somerset. In the late 2008, 2009, George Price was sent an email from someone that said, "I'm the captain of the Somerset. I'd like to talk to you." He said it was a hoax. Captain Somerset's been dead for 200 years. And he started doing a little research, and it was the captain of Somerset. It was the Somerset 3. It was the Somerset 1. This was Somerset 2, the one that we just showed there, that sank. And they hadn't built another one until it was a nuclear cruise ship, a British, that was built. This was the captain of that ship. Huh. By international law, a military naval ship that goes down is always a possession of that country. Meaning the Somerset that you just saw here, this, although it's on Cape Cod and our land, it's owned by Great Britain. They came over not to take possession of it, but they wanted to get they wanted to learn more about it. They wanted to get a sample of it that they could take back to have on the ship. And George took them around to some parties and so forth. They couldn't see it because it was buried back over, but they could see the samples, and they gave several things to them to take back to the ship. But it was interesting. He tried to blow this guy off, but he was definitely the captain of the ship, and he came over a whole contingent of, 5 or 6 others, and turned into a very nice event. It had a lot of publicity. This was, again, a little over 10 years ago. I don't know if you remember it or not. But will it be exposed again? I suspect exposed again sometime in the next 10 or 20 years. Some storm will come through and expose this another time. So enough with the Somerset. Go to the next one. I this general shot up here because I don't have a lot of pictures. The cameras were hard to come by back in the mid-1800s. But there were particularly treacherous years back then. There was 1853 that had an extraordinary number of vessels that went down. It just was a big stormy year. It was one of the worst ones in the history of Cape Cod recorded time. Again, history of Cape Cod for disasters. 1800s was the peak. That's when you had a lot of traffic. You had not all the technology, all the stuff we talked about earlier. We had the Jason, which I showed a picture of at the beginning. I don't think I have a picture. No. The Jason was that ship in the opening picture that I showed there. In 1849, there was a British ship that came aground. I'm mixing up two. The Josephus and the Jason are two different ones. They both lost 24 people. I apologize for they both lost 2 rescuers. But the Josephus was also on Peaks Hill Bar. Broke up. The people from on the shore could hear them screaming offshore, but they couldn't get to them. There's no way to get to them. This led to another example of what led to the life-saving service and so forth. So we need to do something. In fact, if you look at this next drawing or next picture, the red dots on there, this is just a display we have in the museum. I just took a picture of it. But the red dots on there are locations of where there were life-saving stations in the late 1800s. A dozen of them. There are only 2 left now that are used, in Chatham and up in Provincetown, because there's not a need for it. Helicopters, faster boats, and people if they get in trouble, they can power out of it, or they can call, and we can get boat up there pretty fast. So most of them have become historic sites now. Some of them have been moved. The stations and buildings have been moved, but this led to some of these disasters. The Josephus was one of those that people were on shore, unable to help at all. There was nothing they could do. They saw people falling in the water. I'll get to the Jason, which is a similar story in just a second. There was, I read my writing here. In 1853, I said there were 23 large disasters off of Cape Cod, all of which had no resource to respond to it. Some of them were not even known until weeks later when we saw the debris on shore and could identify which vessel it was. So it was a tough time. And then going to just another part of the Cape, and I talked about this last time I was here. I won't dwell on it. It's the city of Columbus. The city of Columbus was a cruise ship that was carrying passengers from Boston down to South Carolina. And they were doing it once a week, up and back. They knew it very well. The captain knew it very well. And they came down around, this is Gay's Head up in here, the lighthouse right up on top up here. Put my finger right there. They went around, they took a buoy on the wrong side and hit a shoal and went down. And 102, 103 people died, and a crew died. I think they saved 20 of them. What's significant about that? First of all, it was before the Titanic. It was an event that had all the publicity because there were a lot of fairly well-off people on board. But from my perspective, it's two things that are important. One is that the Native Americans in Gay's Head, in that area, were the ones that were running the life-saving stations at that point. And they did some of the rescue, and the lighthouse sent people out. This other vessel that's in the front here is the Dexter, which is a revenue cutter. The Coast Guard the name Coast Guard didn't come in until 1915, when the Revenue Cutter Service merged with the life-saving service. But they were doing stuff together before that quite a bit. And this is an example of a particularly heroic rescue. There was some real heroism here, although they did lose quite a few people. All right, I'm going to keep moving on here. This is the Jason. What is particularly interesting about the Jason is my definition of a hero is someone that risks their life for the sake of someone else. They know they're going into a dangerous environment that either they're going to die or be seriously injured. The odds are fairly good that they're going to die. Someone running toward a burning car could explode at any point and pull somebody out. You have 20 people there, and 2 people might run toward the car. The other people are staying back. I might be one of the, I've been tested that way. I may be one of the people that stay back. I don't know how I did run into a burning house one time, but that's another story. So we had the Jason was again offshore. 24, 25 people on it, badly damaged, breaking up. Crew is up in the mast, hanging on for dear life, falling into the ocean. Kind of reminds me, unfortunately, of 9/11 a little bit. They're falling off into the people on shore could hear them screaming as they're falling off. 2 men finally said, "We've had enough. We can't have this happen. We have to do something." So they got a small dinghy, and all their friends said, don't go, you're going to die. He said, we can't stand here and see this happen. We have to go. Unfortunately, they died, but that's a hero. That's somebody that's risking their life. They took the risk. There's another example I'll get to in a second where sometimes this succeeds. You risk your life and you do succeed. But the Jason is a particularly tragic one that, again, helped define, this is the picture from the beginning of the Jason offshore, pretty well beaten up. Again, appreciate the fact this is salt water, a nice day like tonight, sandy beach. What can go wrong? Yeah. It's amazing how fast things go wrong. The Portland. I won't dwell on a Portland. It was the Titanic of New England. They're using that analogy before the Titanic, meaning it sank with, they don't know how many people. 190, 250, they didn't have a good count. The log went down with the ship. No one survived. It was on a route from Boston to Portland, Maine. Came by Provincetown, swung up there. The gale that came in was probably very much like the perfect storm. It was big gale. There were 400 people that died, and there were something like 40 ships that sank when it's called the Portland Gale because the Portland was the biggest of the ships that went down. But it again just showed that there are any variety of things. You run aground, you burn, you run into other ships. There's all sorts of things that occur. This is in 1983. I don't remember the date exactly. I think it was 83. They finally found it with sonar. This is the ship at the bottom of it's out in Stellwagen Bank area. They don't telling the location what divers to go down on it.
That's the Portland?
Excuse me?
That's the Portland?
That is the Portland. Yep.
When did the Portland sink?
1898. 1898. I remembered. It sank then. And so this was, again, almost 100 years later. They finally got sonar down to define it. And again, the location is secret because they don't want people diving on it. It's in reasonably deep water, although it's Cape Cod Bay, so it's not extremely deep. All right, let me go on to a couple more because there are a couple more that are very interesting. This is just a little side. This is the Eastland back in the 1930s. If you look very carefully in here, you can see a couple of people on ice floe right here, and they're backing in and rescuing those. So it could be ice. This was not a shipwreck, but I just tried to put variety in here of things that can go wrong when you're out in the water. They were actually on a little boat to begin with, but that disappeared and they got into ice floe. This is hitting close to home for me. When I grew up, I used to come down and we used to spend a month out in Brewster on the water, and went out and snuck into the fish weirs out there to see what was there. Learned, actually, that's where I developed my love for oceanography in my graduate work and continued. But the target ship was always just off there. I thought, geez, we can always walk out there. We'll get out there and get distracted. We never make it out. We couldn't have been out there because it got deep water, but we always thought we could go. When you go on this Brewster sand flats, you think you can walk forever. Well, this was a Liberty ship, and it was built in World War II for supplies. It worked for a year and a half or so, bringing supplies back and forth to Europe. Finally, I ran into a British ship, as it turned out, just outside New York, and damaged, and a gale took it, put it aground during the same incident. It was finally refloated from being aground. It didn't sink to the bottom, but refloated from being aground. Brought into New York, did some repairs on it, decided that it was a goner, couldn't do anything with it. So he turned it into a target ship. They put it off of Floyd Bennett Field in New York for a while. It's actually down in Pimlico Bay, down south of Norfolk for a while. Then finally in 1945, April 26th, I think it was, 1945, it was moved up to the Cape. Polaroid was developing guided missiles, and they wanted something large enough there they could bring guided missiles in and practice on this. So they put it out there, and it's been a landmark, I think, for us that have grown up in the Cape. Since it disappeared finally in the late 90s, I think below tide you can still see it, or extreme low tides. But it is the Longstreet, coincidentally named after a Confederate general, if you know the Civil War. This was snapped while it was still underway. Considering, in fact, it was only less than a year old here, it's looking pretty bad for less than a year old. But this is what I remember. This, and some of you may remember it. It's sitting out there in the middle of Mass Bay, only about 3 or 4 miles off of Eastham, to the west of Eastham. It's on the inside, and it's still there, but it got shifted by this big snowstorm that came through in the 80s or so. I think it shifted it out a little bit further. It's about 20 feet of water. It takes an extreme low spring tide to have it exposed. It's unfair because I'm talking about shipwrecks on Cape Cod. This didn't have a shipwreck here, but it is a shipwreck that's in Cape Cod, so I suppose. This is not uncommon. This vessel was a Panamanian vessel that ran aground. This was the day after. It calmed down quite a bit. This is one of the last occasions that we used the Lyle gun and beach carts to send out a breeches buoy to pull people in. It took several hours, but they rescued everyone off this, and no deaths from it. But it drew crowds, people sitting on shore. It was a chance to see it. This was 1953. You can kind of guess by the dress, I suppose, if you're really into that. I just know the date. I couldn't guess from the dress. All right, I'm not going to dwell on this one because I could spend hours on this. The Pendleton, but the T2 tanker that was built for a tanker for oil, kerosene transport during the war, as was a Liberty ship, built not to the highest standards. They built them fairly well, but they had some design flaws. One of the design flaws was that if it got pretty cold outside and you got in rough weather, they tended to split in half. That's not a good thing. It's not all of you are mariners. As a mariner, I can tell you, splitting in half in a rough sea is not good. So, as you may recall, in 1952, the Fort Mercer was about 20 miles off Cape Cod, off of Chatham, and it had radio communication. It's a T2 tanker. It had broken in half. It got communication out, and all sorts of Coast Guard resources got there, helicopter. It got almost everyone off. They lost maybe 5 or 6 people off of that, I think, as I recall. But then they found that there was another T2 tanker, it was a little close to the shore, had lost its radio. It was the Pendleton. And I won't believe in a story if someone wants to talk about it later. I think if you've seen the film, the Disney film that came out a few years ago, that was Bernie Weber with the 36-500 went out. A hero, no question in my mind. There are some heroes, I've tried to define heroes, and we have an exhibit on heroism now at the museum, what makes a hero. He was sitting in a safe environment at the station, and he said he had to go out. He knew the ship was there, saved 32 people that would have otherwise been lost, and it was clearly heroism. If you want more, I can go on. In fact, I'll show, it can go on for quite a bit here. 32 saved off tanker. Let me mention something about Bernie Weber, though, that's significant. One interesting aside, his daughter, Patty Weber Hamilton, I've got to know fairly well. She was over in Barnstable Harbor, but they brought the boat over last week for us. It still exists, that boat, that 36-footer still exists, and it's over in Rock Harbor in Orleans for most of the summer. And they take it out infrequently, but they decided to come over to Barnstable Harbor for us. Patty didn't know that her father was involved in this until she was in her 30s, clearly well into her adulthood. He was not a guy that bragged about it. A Coast Guard crew, I just did things, went out and saved people and a few things like that, nothing heroic. But he was embarrassed by this rescue because he lost one person. They saved 32. There was absolutely nothing they could do. There was the cook, 300 plus pounds. He didn't have any life-saving equipment on. There was no way to grab him. He fell off when he was coming down and hit the water and got between the boat and the ship and was killed. All the crew, the 4 people on there, it bothered them tremendously. Not the fact that they saved 32, not the fact that they couldn't have possibly saved this guy. There was nothing even in retrospect, but it bothered him. Bernie was a guy later in his career, at the end of his career, had a command of a small patrol boat with a crew of about 12 on board. They said, Bernie, we're going to have a grad ceremony for you, and you're at your retirement. He says, geez, I'm not really comfortable. They said, well, it'll be good for the Coast Guard. And Bernie loved the Coast Guard. I said, okay. And they say, Bernie, oh, by the way, the boat that you're commanding right now, this is the end of your career, we're sending out to Vietnam with the crew. We said, no way in hell, you're sending us to Vietnam without me. And they said, well, you're retiring. I said, no, he didn't usually make a stink, but he made a stink, and they let him go. And he went over to Vietnam and came back safely with the crew. Did a good job. I'll take a step back, though. After this particular rescue, the Coast Guard doesn't give it to any active duty anymore, but used to give a gold life-saving medal, which was infrequently given out to, particularly every few years, maybe every decade, they give a gold life-saving medal out. The silver life-saving medal, almost as prestigious, but a step below. They went to Bernie and said, Bernie, we're giving you a gold life-saving medal. I said, whatever. Then again, he said, it'll be good for the Coast Guard. I said, okay. They said, we're going to give your 3 crew member silver life-saving medals. This is great. He says, no. Either all of us get gold or all of us get silver. That's it. And finally won that too. So he was that sort of guy, my sort of hero, if you will. This is the 36-500. Andrea Doria, my wife's grandmother, who lived to be 104, I digress here a little bit. She lived in 3 centuries, by the way. Just 3 centuries. She was born to live, I think, 4 months in the 19th century, all the 20th, and 4 years in the 21st century. She was from Italy. She flew over. Oh no, I'm sorry. She took a cruise ship over to Italy, and was coming back on Andrea Doria, but she decided at the last moment to take a plane instead. This is in 1953. Or 56, 53, 56. Was it 6? Not that everyone, this was not the Titanic, this was kind of the opposite of Titanic. A lot were saved and a few died. A few, though, 43, 45 people, I think, died. There were 2 or 3 on the Stockholm. This was a collision, 2 cruise ships. One going into New York, one coming out of New York, just south of Nantucket, collided, and there were 50 some odd that were lost. Some amazing survival, though. The ships collided, went into staterooms. The Stockholm, tragically or coincidentally, had a icebreaker bow on it. They rammed. This was not. I think it was more the Andrea Doria's fault, and they were trying to avoid each other, and they take wrong turns and hit them broadside. The Andrea Doria sank ultimately. It took several hours, like the Titanic, but it sank, and it. One of the people on the Andrea Doria that was in a stateroom that was crushed by this, they discovered her on the Stockholm, the other vessel, when they took her alive. So she was actually survived and put on another ship, not by intention. Didn't crawl over there. She just found herself on the other ship alive, quite coincidental. So I won't go into that a little bit, except to point out another example. Collisions. Doesn't have to be weather. Doesn't have to be fog or this was. I won't go into this one. This was off of south of Martha's Vineyard a few years ago. Again, many. Let me skip this one. You can see there was some significant damage. This was an interesting one, Argo Merchant. I think many of you remember the Argo Merchant. It was 1976, I think it was. Argo Merchant was not in the best of condition, and it kind of fell apart, ran aground, had all sorts of problems. Anyway, it ran aground and ultimately dispersed its oil. The reason this is interesting to point out, the Coast Guard was right there and got everyone off. I don't think anyone was lost. I don't think there was any death. But there was a lot of oil that was dumped into the ocean. This could have been Exxon Valdez or whatever. God was on our side, if you will, if you want to think this. The wind that day for the next 2 days was offshore, put all that oil way out to sea, and by the time it dispersed, didn't get any on Nantucket. It was just a short distance from Nantucket. It would have devastated Cape Cod. It was amazing. You can see this was just after the grounding, what good shape the Argo Merchant was in. You can tell down here that it's showing its true colors. It was in terrible shape. This was one just to talk about something this isn't all 18th, 19th century. In fact, I'll show one that's 21st century. This is late 20th century. The Royal Majesty, you may remember, grounded off of Nantucket. The Royal Majesty was the one that's still doing today. It's not the Royal Majesty doing those trips from Boston to Bermuda and back in a week. We did one maybe 20 years ago too. It was coming up from Bermuda, and for a lot of technical reasons, mostly electronic, they were too dependent on electronic computers. They went aground on sand, and there were a lot of stupid things that were done. They didn't set for example, they have a depth finder that's supposed to go off when you get below 20 feet under the hull. It had been inadvertently set to 0. It doesn't help much. The GPS had been disconnected, and the computers, if it doesn't get the GPS, will default to what's called dead reckoning. But they didn't recognize it was dead reckoning. And dead reckoning is an estimate of where you're going, but they were being pushed onto the shore. They had a buoy, the critical buoy they passed, and they misidentified it and missed that. And they went pretty solidly aground. No one was injured. Just to show you this, I had a good friend that went to college with him named Barney Turlow. He was the captain of port up in Providence at the time, and he was assigned as the investigating officer. So they flew him out to the ship. It was still aground out there. He did all the stuff, and they found the electronics problems and all the things that had occurred and who was at fault. And when he got back to Boston, the press interviewed him, and after he went through all the things, they said, "This is Nantucket Lighthouse right here, easily visible." He said, in navigating ships, every once in a while you need to look out the window. There's a lighthouse right there. This was the buoy they missed right over here. You can see this BB buoys. They should have been up in here. They're over here. There are fishermen in here kind of yelling to them on the radio, "You're inside." It was. They lost about a couple months worth of time. They actually ended up retrofitting it and so forth, and it's being still in service someplace else. Now, the Iana, that went aground a couple years ago, if you recall, in Hyannis Harbor. Another cause for accidents. I've mentioned several. I would argue, I was not the investigating officer on this, so this is just my opinion. This was complacency. These were talented people. They were good. They had done this from Nantucket to Hyannis hundreds of times. Between the pilot and the captain that were on board, they had 60 years of experience. They knew this harbor extremely well, but they didn't. They became complacent. Oh, it's easy. It was a storm. It was this dark and stormy night. Hold on one second. Let me go back. This is the route they took in. This is the route they should have been taking right here, coming into Hyannis Harbor. This is the one they took. And what happened is that there are some rocks right here, and there are buoys there. But they saw there was a sailboat in here and another marker that was not normal, another boat, that marker, and they identified those as the turning points that they were shooting for. They said, oh, that's just a normal turning point. Visibility was low, but they'd been through it so many times they were confident. Understand, they had a computer printout like this, a screen that showed everything, but they, oh, we know, we've been through this too many times. They came straight in and hit this little line right here is the breakwater. They went right up on the breakwater pretty hard. Fortunately, no one was killed. There was some injury, as you may recall. This, you can actually see the breakwater here, back underneath here. So it's sitting pretty high on it. Anyway, this is not necessarily, it's not as common today, but the results can be serious. Oil spills, all that still occur. So shipwrecks, I'm just going to spend another minute or two talking about this other thing I wanted to mention. And for Cape Codders, for you that heard the last lecture, heard Nancy Shoemaker talk, you heard this before, so I won't dwell on it. But this is the year aviation history. 50 years ago, there was the Apollo 11, one giant leap for mankind. 100 years ago, there was another event. There was one, no question, there was one giant leap for mankind. I would argue that it was on the same scale. It was the first aircraft to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. This was not Lindbergh. This was 8 years before Lindbergh. This was a Navy NC-4 was the aircraft, Navy Curtiss aircraft. Just after World War I, they were developing it for World War I to fly it over to Europe to resupply that way instead of they were still sending aircraft to Europe, but they had to disassemble them, take them over there. They were prone to attacks by U-boats and so forth. They prefer to fly them over. So they developed. Let me show a little bit of it. During the war, they developed I'm going the wrong way. This was the NC-4. The NC-4 was one of 4 that they made. The NC-4 was the only one that made it. The other one never was able to get underway. There were pushing it. These were prototypes. They were pushing every envelope, and finally, in the end, the NC-3 they just cannibalized for parts. So they took off with 3 of them. All 3 made it all the way to Nova Scotia. This was not nonstop. It was not solo. Lindbergh had that. Obviously, that's why he became so famous. This had 6 crew members, and it was not nonstop. This aircraft took off from New York. So they're saying this first flight took off from New York. We as Cape Codders say, no. By accident, this aircraft, the NC-4 was the only one. They're all heading toward Nova Scotia to Halifax. The NC-4 developed a mechanical problem, lost one of its engines, second engine started to fail, so they landed on the water. These were flying boats. There's a technical difference between the two. It's a hull of a boat with pontoons, as opposed to seaplanes, which the pontoons in the water and the hull is up above. These are flying, but this was not a small aircraft. In fact, this is the NC-4. This is small, but just to put it in proportion, the distance between the wings was 12 feet. Wow. This aircraft, the NC-1, 6 months earlier, were doing a prototype testing. One of its first flights carried 51 people on board it. And this is those people are replaced for the flight with fuel tanks. There were enormous fuel tanks that had a lot of weight. But the reason it's important to me and to all of us here, I think, is that it had this mechanical problem, had to land off of Chatham, had to taxi back in, not a mile or two, 60 miles, taxi back into Chatham. They repaired it. They couldn't take off for a couple days because of weather. They finally caught up to the other 2 aircraft, which at that point had made up to Nova Scotia. And all 3 of them left from Nova Scotia, heading toward Azores, then to Lisbon. That was the flight across the Atlantic. Again, the first flight. The other 2 encountered some difficulties, no loss of life, but the weather and so forth. They had to land in the water, and the seas weren't good. They kind of broke up and they had to be saved. The NC-4 made it to the Azores and continued on. Coincidentally, the NC-4, let me remind you, was the only aircraft that had to leave from Cape Cod. From my opinion, the first aircraft that flew across the Atlantic Ocean left from Cape Cod. New York was just a logistics flight up to Cape Cod. More importantly, from my perspective, and for some others in this room, the pilot of the NC-4, all the crew were Navy people, with a couple exceptions. One was a guy called Elmer Stone, Archie Stone, lieutenant, Coast Guard aviator number 1. Not GOAT like Tom Brady. He was the first. He was good too, but he was recruited by them and said, Archie, we want you to fly one of these aircraft across. Okay, I'm good for that. He was flying the NC-4. So the only aircraft that made it across was left from Cape Cod and piloted by a Coast Guard pilot. What more could you want? Anyway, we took the time, I should say, on May 14th of this year to go out to Chatham and have a ceremony there. We had a Coast Guard Honor Guard. This unfortunately is me. The wind was blowing high. You can tell from the flags. This is not a calm day. The flags are out straight. We're going to have a Coast Guard flyby. The ceiling was only about 100 feet, so they couldn't fly by. We persisted, though, and had the ceremony there, and it was great to have that. Let me go the other way. This, is, by the way, is the 51 people all lined up here with that NC-1 when it flew. You can see all 51 of them on board this aircraft. So it wasn't a tiny aircraft. This was the three of them. I'll just go through. The three aircraft, the NC-1, 2, and 4, taking off from New York. These are the 6 people. Elmer Stone, the pilot, is the second one in from the left. The British, everyone was competing to get across at this point. The British were trying to do it. The British completed the flight 2 weeks after and did it non-stop from Newfoundland and crash landed in Ireland. They were the first. That overshadowed a little bit, but they still weren't the first to cross the Atlantic. They may have done it non-stop. But they said, well, the Americans were cheating. The reason they said they were cheating is, if you look carefully in here, all these little dots here are naval ships. They were used for navigation, so the flight, they didn't land, although it turned out that one of them had to save the other 2 that did have the crash, but they were going from ship to ship by navigation. They put flares up at night and smoke up to navigate across, so they said, oh, that's cheating. No, it wasn't. This had a lot of vessels after the war. Distances, I won't go into that, but this was, just one last thing I'll leave you with. There was a naval air station in Chatham. It only existed for about 4 years during World War. It came in for about the last year of World War I and stayed on for another 2 or 3 years after that. And that was the one that worked on the NC-4 to get it back and operating, get to fly again. That's where our ceremony was. There was no sign of that air station there. It hasn't been since the 20s. In fact, it's all high-end, multi-million-dollar homes there. You wouldn't know, except for this is the NC-4 today. It still exists. It's down at the Naval Air Station Museum in Pensacola. I can't find it here. That's the Argo Merchant again. Oh, there's our flags. You can tell there's one plaque that exists there. This is a plaque. That's all that shows that this was the site of where the aircraft took off from the water. It's just offshore, right there. And I think that's part of our role. It's a Coast Guard Heritage Museum. It's those events that we try to highlight as much as possible. Last year, it was the astronaut program. So what the hell is the Coast Guard have to do with astronauts? Well, the Coast Guard has had 2 officers that have been astronauts. One of them lives in Yarmouth, and he's involved with the museum. He and a classmate of mine, a guy that was at the academy with me, came up last year, and we had a whole lecture series with the 2 of them talking about their experience. They didn't just go up on one flight. Dan Burkhardt spent 6 months, 6 months a year on the Soyuz space station. Soyuz space station, I'll point out, you had to speak Russian on it. So he had to learn Russian fluently to function on that. It was a Russian space station. Anyway, do you have any, another example of the wind? It was a beautiful day. Not only was it windy, but it was cold. But it's a good Coast Guard day, you know? Yeah. We'd like to go out in the rough weather. So this is a shipwreck. If anyone wants to help restore it, you're welcome to. Any questions at all? Yes?
When the hull of the Somerset was exposed, was there any thought of trying to excavate it, dig it up?
No, in fact, that's when they discovered, doing the research, that it wasn't the property. It was part of the National Park Service land at that point. But then they did research on it and said, you know, it's not yours, it's England. So they did take some of the parts and have it on display. It also was quite a large structure. They, as opposed to the Sparrowhawk, which they were able to get the whole thing out and take it out. This was, first of all, it wasn't exposed for very long. It was a matter of days that it was exposed and covered back in very, very fast, which is good, I guess. It's protected down under the sand. And there's no question that it's going to be re-exposed at some point. Although if the ice keeps melting, it's going to be deeper and deeper in the water, I suppose. Yes?
Do you know if Oregon Beach here in Pursuit is named for a shipwreck? Is it related to the SS Oregon?
No, I don't know.
I heard that not long ago. I'm curious.
No, I don't know. I think when you said Oregon Inlet, I think of out in Seattle or out in Washington. There's organ in there, different one. Yes.
You didn't mention anything about World War II. I was wondering if there were many shipwrecks or any shipwrecks here related to sinkings.
There were some. Actually, let me digress for a second. World War One. World War One, the air station out at Chatham was obviously designed. They had flying boats there, and they had blimps there to protect the Russians coming in. Well, there was a U-boat that came up just off of Chatham, and they flew an aircraft out. They hadn't tested the bombs. They put bombs on it. They think there may have been some sabotage involved, but neither of the bombs they dropped went off. The pilot got so frustrated that he actually threw a monkey wrench at one of whether it hit it or not, I don't know. But they didn't do any damage. They left the area. So the first air naval engagement in the United States was between these two, and involved a monkey wrench. But I'm digressing. I don't know. Does anyone else know about what sort of? There was activity here, but there was. I'll digress just for a second. We're doing a lot of oral histories, so we still have a chance to do oral histories with people that served during World War II. One of the people that I interviewed last year, 97 years old, is a chief that was in charge of security at the Naval Air Station on Martha's Vineyard. He has some very interesting stories out there. He was in charge of the shore patrol, in charge of the fire department, and just had intriguing stories. Among those is said, we never saw Germans there. There was no sign of that. Our concerns, our security stuff involved, frankly, one of the big ones was people trying to sell, they were getting gasoline, going out to the fence and selling them to people outside because there was such a shortage of gasoline. And back to this Goody Hallett situation, there was a lot of liaisons going on because all the men in Nantucket on Martha's Vineyard had left for the war. So all the sailors that were left there serving had a lot of opportunities, let's say. He said, so he spent a lot of time out on the edge of the fences kind of breaking things up. That was part of his role. But anyway, that doesn't answer. I'm just avoiding the question. I don't know. Yes.
Do you coordinate at all with the Marconi Museum?
Yes. Yes, we do.
In what way?
In what way? Well, I have a couple of good friends out there and they were involved a little bit with the ceremony we had with the NC4 out there on Strong Island Road. If you know that road where the golf course is in North Chatham, if there's such a name, there's a big golf course there, the name of it. And there's a road that goes out, it comes Strong Island Road, and ends in this parking lot where you saw the flag flying. You look across at Strong Island, which is where Jake Cashman owns the whole island. He has his big house out there on that. But it's interesting to go out there to understand that there was this air station here. And I don't know if I showed that, but this was not small. These were big hangars. These two were for airships. This was for the seaplanes in here. Strong Island Road is this one coming out here. Our ceremony was right here. The golf course now is all back in here. And 28 is back
Oh, that's
here.
right near Pleasant.
It's right near the Marconi Museum, just across the street and up a little.
Would that be referred to as Nickerson Point?
Yes, I think it is. It has various names over the year. It was also called Airplane Point when the air station was there. It was but I think that is the name that has been used there.
Years ago, my dad bought property, had a summer home built off there. But one of the first things they had to do was make sure they didn't have any moorings buried in the sand.
Oh,
Or it used to be a mooring point for airships.
yeah.
That was the start of it.
Names change so much. I really digress a little bit. I'm just finishing up a property up here that I invested in about 10 years ago that I'm just listing next week. But it's on something called Shaver Hill Road. Well, Shaver Hill Road is Falmouth Road now. And if you know where the water station is on the road, just about a mile this side of Stop and Shop, as you go up that hill was called Shaver Hill Road because on the back of my property I've restored, it was an old barber shop back there, and it was called Shaver Hill Road. Apparently, rumor has it because some people said, well, there was a mill there at one point too. It may have been shavings from the mill, but I think most people suggest it was that. So names change. I think Shaver, I've never heard anyone else refer to that section of Falmouth Road as Shaver Hill, but if anyone's interested in buying a property, by the way, or stop by and help out. I've got some more restoration to do. Yes.
One more question.
Yes.
The target ship off at Eastham. Okay, was it true many years ago when you would have during the winter when you would have ice now and then the Coast Guard would have to go out and lift teenagers off because they were trying to get their way to the township.
I never experienced that, but it wouldn't surprise me if that could have happened. They get trapped out there and the tide comes in and they're screwed up. So I would guess the answer is yes, but that's sort of like the internet. You can't trust everything you hear. Any other questions? Yeah.
Did you ever come across any information on a shipwreck called the Christina, 1863, wintertime, coal steamer, Cape Cod? One of my relatives.
The
was a
name
sole
sounds
survivor.
vaguely familiar. I don't have it in my notes here, but it does
I'm
sound.
just curious.
You know, it's one of the 3,000.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, thank you for sticking with me.
Thank you.